The distress signal came at the worst possible hour, pulling Commander Valen Soreth from the only deep sleep she had managed in 3 rotations. Her 4 eyes snapped open as the alarm screamed through her quarters, and she knew before checking the display that something terrible had happened on Kethvora Prime. She ran through the cold metal corridors of Station 12, her clawed feet clicking against the floor in a rhythm that matched her racing hearts. 2 hearts beating fast meant fear, and Valen had learned long ago to trust that feeling. The command center was already filled with officers when she arrived, their scales and fur and chitinous shells reflecting the red emergency lights that painted everything in the color of blood. On the main screen, a map of Kethvora Prime rotated slowly, and a single blinking dot marked the last known position of the research shuttle that had gone down. Report, Valen demanded. Taking her place at the central console, Lieutenant Morix, a thin Vishan with trembling antennae, pulled up the data with shaking hands. The shuttle belonging to the research vessel Wandering Star crashed approximately 6 hours ago in the deep jungle zone, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We lost contact immediately after impact, and all attempts to reach the pilot have failed. Who was on board? Morix hesitated, and that hesitation told Valen everything she needed to know about how bad this situation truly was. Dr. Elena Vasquez, he finally answered. Human, female, xenobotanist, age 34 standard years. A murmur ran through the command center, and Valen understood why. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, still proving themselves, still trying to earn respect from species that had traveled between stars when humanity was still living in caves. Sending a human to Kethvora Prime had been controversial from the start. The deep jungle zone, Valen repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air like a death sentence. She crashed in the deep jungle zone. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Kethvora Prime was not just dangerous, it was legendary in its hostility. The planet had claimed 17 survey teams across 4 different species over the past 50 years, and every single one of those deaths had occurred in the deep jungle zone. Nothing survived there, nothing except the monsters that called it home. We need to send a rescue team immediately, said a young officer whose name Valen could not remember, with respect. Commander, came a deep growling voice from the back of the room. There is nothing to rescue. Valen turned to face Kethril, the senior tracker of the Torvasi Hunting Guild. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his 8 limbs folded against his armored body, his countless eyes reflecting the emergency lights like a constellation of tiny red stars. The Torvasi were the greatest hunters in 12 systems, and when they said something was dead, the galaxy listened. Explain yourself, tracker, Valen said. Though she already knew what he would say, Kethril moved forward with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known fear. I have hunted on Kethvora Prime 4 times, he said. Each time I lost warriors, strong warriors, experienced warriors, warriors bred for killing across 1,000 generations. The deep jungle does not allow survival. The human is already dead. You cannot know that for certain. I know it as I know my own heartbeat. Kethril replied without hesitation. The bioluminescent canopy alone would disorient her within minutes. The carnivorous flora releases spores that paralyze prey before consuming them slowly over days. The apex predators grow larger than your shuttles and hunt anything that moves. And those are merely the dangers we have documented. He paused, letting his words sink in. The human had no weapons beyond a standard survival knife. She had no armor, no natural defenses, no venom, no claws worth mentioning. Her species cannot see in darkness, cannot run faster than the slowest predator, cannot heal from wounds that my kind would consider minor inconveniences. So you recommend we do nothing? Valen asked. I recommend we accept reality, Kethril answered. The human is dead. Sending rescue teams would only add more bodies to the count. I will not risk my trackers on a recovery mission for a corpse. The command center fell silent, and Valen looked around at the faces of her crew. She saw agreement in most of them, resignation in others. They had all heard the stories about Kethvar Prime, all seen the footage of previous expeditions gone wrong. All watched the recovered recordings of final moments filled with screaming and blood and things moving in the darkness. Very well, Valen said at last, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. Log the incident and prepare the formal declaration. Dr. Elena Vasquez is officially listed as lost, presumed deceased. She turned away from the screen, away from that single blinking dot that would soon stop blinking entirely. Somewhere in the back of her mind, something nagged at her, some feeling she could not identify, but she pushed it aside. The Taurasi were never wrong about death. What Commander Valen did not know, what none of them could possibly have known, was that 30 kilometers into the zone they had declared unsurvivable, Darlene Vasquez was very much alive. She was bleeding from a gash on her forehead where she had struck the console during the crash. Her left arm hung at an angle that suggested something was badly wrong with her shoulder. Her emergency beacon had shattered on impact, and her communication equipment was nothing but sparking wreckage scattered across the jungle floor around her. The alien forest pulsed with bioluminescent light in colors that had no names in any human language. Things moved in the shadows between massive trees. Things with too many legs and too many teeth and appetites that had never known the taste of human flesh. Elena pulled herself free from the ruined shuttle and stood, on shaking legs, taking in her situation with eyes that had not yet learned to fear this place. She was alone, injured, cut off from any hope of rescue, stranded on a planet that had killed everyone who had ever tried to survive it. She took a deep breath of air that tasted like copper and rotting flowers and something else she could not identify. Okay, she said to herself, her voice steady despite everything. Okay, this is bad, but I have survived bad before. Let us see what we are working with here. She did not know that the galaxy had already written her obituary. She did not know that the greatest hunters in 12 systems had declared her survival impossible. She did not know that she was supposed to lie down and die like every other soft creature that had ever set foot in this jungle. Elena Vasquez knew only one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to die on this planet. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And somewhere in the darkness of the alien jungle, something ancient and hungry heard her moving and began to hunt. Elena crouched inside the wreckage of her shuttle, listening to the sounds of the alien jungle as it came alive in the darkness. Clicks and screams and wet slithering noises surrounded her on all sides. And more than once, she saw massive shapes moving between the glowing trees. Shapes that made her heart freeze in her chest. She did not sleep. She could not sleep. Every time her eyes began to close, something would shriek in the distance or something would brush against the hull of the crashed shuttle. Testing it, probing it, trying to find a way inside by the time the first pale light filtered through the bioluminescent canopy. Elena had made a decision. She could stay here and wait for rescue that might never come, slowly starving while the creatures of this jungle grew bolder and bolder. Or she could move, adapt, survive. She chose survival. It was the only choice a human being could ever really make. Her first task was to assess what she had. The shuttle was mostly destroyed, but she managed to salvage a survival knife with a blade as long as her forearm, a water purifier that still seemed to function, 3 emergency ration bars that would last perhaps a week if she was careful, a medical kit with basic supplies, and various pieces of metal and wire that might prove useful. It was not much. But Elena had worked with less. She remembered her grandmother's stories about surviving in the Amazon. about the tricks and techniques passed down through generations of people who had learned to live in places that wanted them dead. She remembered her own experiences in Earth's wildest places, the lessons written in scar tissue and close calls and nights spent shivering in the darkness. The jungle is not your enemy, her grandmother had always said. The jungle is a puzzle. Learn its rules, and you can live anywhere. Elena intended to learn the rules of this new jungle. No matter how alien they might be, she started by watching. For 3 full days, she barely moved from the crash site, instead observing everything around her, with the patience of a scientist and the focus of someone whose life depended on every detail. She watched how the bioluminescent plants pulsed in patterns that seemed almost like communication. She watched how the smaller creatures moved, and where they went, and what they avoided on the second day. She noticed something important about the glowing vines that hung from every tree. When she moved slowly, barely faster than a crawl, the vines remained dormant, but when a small creature darted past at speed, the vines lashed out with lightning quickness and wrapped around the unfortunate animal. Squeezing until bones cracked, motion activated, Elena murmured to herself. Good to know. On the 3rd day, she mapped the territory of the first apex predator she encountered. The creature was massive, easily the size of a cargo truck, with armored plates covering most of its body and a mouth filled with teeth longer than her arm. She watched it from a safe distance as it patrolled a specific area, never straying beyond invisible boundaries that only it seemed to recognize territorial. She realized they do not hunt beyond their own zones. If she could identify those zones, she could move between them, slipping through the gaps in their hunting grounds. By the 4th day, Elena was ready to move. The spores proved to be her greatest challenge at first. They hung in the air like clouds of golden dust, released by flowers that bloomed without warning, and she had seen what they did to living things. A creature that breathed them in would freeze in place, paralyzed but still aware, as the plants slowly extended tendrils to consume it over the course of days. But Elena was a xenobotanist. She had spent her entire career studying alien plants, and she recognized the basic principles at work. The spores were too large to be absorbed through skin contact, which meant they had to be inhaled to take effect. She tore strips from her clothing and wove them together with fibers from non-carnivorous plants, creating a crude filter mask that she could tie around her face. It was not perfect, but it was enough. When she walked through her first spore cloud with the mask in place, she emerged on the other side, still breathing, still moving, still alive. The jungle did not know what to make of her day after day. Elena pushed deeper into the death zone, learning as she went. She discovered which fungi were safe to eat by watching what the small scavenger creatures avoided. She found that certain trees produced a sap that burned slowly when dried, giving her the ability to make fire. She learned that the apex predators, for all their terrifying size and power, were afraid of flames, backing away from even a small torch with what looked almost like fear fire. Elena thought with grim satisfaction. Humanity's oldest friend, she built her first real camp on day 8, choosing a spot between 3 territorial boundaries where no major predator would venture. She constructed walls from fallen branches and hardened them with dried sap. She set up trip lines made from salvaged wire that would alert her to approaching threats. She dug a pit and filled it with sharpened stakes, covering it with leaves and waiting for something to fall, and something did fall in on day 9. A medium-sized predator with 6 legs and far too many eyes. Elena killed it with her knife, butchered it with skills she had learned as a girl, and smoked the meat over her fire for the first time since the crash. She ate until she was full. By day 12, Elena had stopped merely surviving. She was thriving in a place that had killed every other intelligent being who had ever entered it. She had fresh water from her purifier and a collection system that caught the strange alien rain. She had a growing store of preserved meat and edible plants. She had weapons she had crafted herself, a spear tipped with a predator's tooth. Traps that caught food while she slept. She began to explore further, mapping the jungle as she went, marking safe paths and danger zones with symbols carved into trees. She studied the plants with the eye of a scientist, collecting samples and recording observations in her head, since she had nothing to write with, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought began to form. Rescue might come, or it might not, but either way, Elena Vasquez was not going to be found as a corpse when they came for her. If they came for her, they would find something the galaxy had never seen before. They would find a human who had conquered the unconquerable. The jungle still tried to kill her. Every single day, of course. That never stopped. But Elena had grown up on a planet that had spent millions of years trying to kill her ancestors, and they had one she intended to do the same. Catherall had been tracking prey across hostile worlds since before humans had discovered fire, and in all that time, he had never once been wrong about death. When something died, he knew it. When something lived, he knew that too. It was instinct, bone deep, and unshakable. The foundation upon which his entire reputation had been built. So when the first report came in from a Veshan trading vessel, he dismissed it without a second thought. Thermal anomaly in the deep zone, the captain had reported. Structured heat signature, possibly a controlled fire, located approximately 30 kilometers past the boundary. Impossible, Catherall had replied. Your sensors are malfunctioning. Nothing makes fire in the deep zone, because nothing lives long enough to make fire in the deep zone. The Veshan captain had simply shrugged and moved on, content to have filed his report and be done with it. But then came the second report. A survey satellite passing over Cathvora Prime detected the same thermal signature, now in a slightly different location. The computers analyzed the heat pattern and concluded with 97% certainty that it was artificial in origin. A fire built and maintained by an intelligent being. Catherall examined the data himself, searching for errors, searching for explanations that did not involve the impossible. Perhaps a piece of the crash shuttle was still burning somehow. Perhaps some natural phenomenon was creating the signature. Perhaps the satellite itself was damaged. None of these explanations held up under scrutiny. This means nothing, he told Commander Valen when she summoned him to discuss the findings. Even if something did survive the initial crash, it cannot last. The jungle will claim it eventually. Valen said nothing, but her four eyes watched him with an expression he did not like, an expression that suggested she was beginning to doubt. The third report came from the jungle's edge, from a team of Kethvari traders who had been gathering resources in the relatively safe outer zones. They spoke of strange markings carved into trees, symbols they had never seen before. Arranged in patterns that seemed almost like a language, they spoke of traps they had found, complex mechanisms of bent wood and woven vine that would catch and kill small prey with mechanical efficiency. They spoke of a territorial predator, one of the massive armored beasts that even the Kethvari feared, found dead in a clearing with its skull crushed by a heavy stone that had somehow been suspended above a trail and triggered to fall when the creature passed beneath. These are the techniques of a Briandvo hunter, one of the Kethvari elders said, his voice trembling with something between fear and wonder. But no hunter we know. No hunter from any world we have ever encountered. Word began to spread across Station 12, whispered in corridors and discussed in quiet corners of recreation areas. The human was alive. The human was surviving. The human was doing things that should not be possible. Catherall refused to believe it. But the evidence kept mounting on day 18. A cargo drone passing over the deep zone captured footage that would eventually be viewed millions of times across the galactic network. The image was grainy, distorted by the interference from Cathvora Prime's strange atmosphere. But it showed something unmistakable, a lone figure walking through a spore field that should have killed anything that entered it. The figure moved with purpose and confidence. Wrapped in what appeared to be salvaged materials and woven plant fibers, face covered by some kind of mask. In one hand, the figure carried a spear, tipped with what looked like a tooth from an apex predator. In the other hand, it carried something flat and marked with lines. It took the analysts 3 days to determine what that flat object was. It was a map, a hand-drawn map of the Deep Zone, created by someone who had traveled extensively through terrain that no surveyor had ever survived long enough to document. Commander Valen watched the footage 17 times before she finally accepted what she was seeing. "She is not just alive," she said softly. "She is thriving. She is exploring. She is learning this place." The Kethvari began telling stories about the pale ghost in the Deathlands, the firebringer who walked where nothing walked, the spirit that the darkness could not swallow. These stories spread to their trading partners, and from there to the wider galactic community, growing larger and stranger with each retelling on Station 12. The mood shifted from morbid certainty to confused fascination. Officers who had written Elena Vasquez off as dead now found themselves checking for updates every shift, eager for new evidence that she was still out there, still fighting, still refusing to die. Kethril watched all of this with growing unease. He had spent his entire life as a hunter, and hunters understood prey. They understood what creatures could survive and what creatures could not. Humans were soft, weak, slow, and fragile. They had no natural weapons worth mentioning, no armor, no venom, no ability to regenerate from wounds. By every measure that mattered, they should have been among the easiest prey in the galaxy. And yet this one human was doing something that his own warriors, bred for killing across 1,000 generations, had failed to do. She was conquering the unconquerable. "What are you?" he murmured to himself, staring at the footage of that lone figure walking through the death spores as casually as if she were strolling through a garden. He did not have an answer. And for the first time in his long life, Kethril, the hunter, felt something he had never experienced before. He felt afraid, not of the jungle, which he had faced many times, not of the predators, which he had killed and been wounded by, not of death, which he had accepted as an inevitable companion. He felt afraid of the human, because if Elena Vasquez could survive Kethvara Prime, if she could walk through spore fields and kill apex predators and build fires in the heart of the death zone, then everything he thought he knew about her species was wrong. And if his knowledge was wrong about this, what else might he be wrong about? What else might humanity be capable of? The question haunted him through sleepless nights as more reports filtered in, as the legend of the pale ghost grew larger and stranger, as the impossible became undeniable somewhere in that jungle. A human was rewriting the rules of survival itself, and the galaxy was beginning to pay attention. Commander Valen ignored the Council's objections, ignored the warnings from her superiors, ignored everything except the certainty burning in her chest that she had to see this with her own eyes. She assembled 3 shuttles, filled them with the best soldiers and scientists Station 12 could offer, and set course for Kethvar Prime. Kethril came too, though he never explained why. Perhaps he needed to see for himself. Perhaps he needed to understand what was happening in that jungle. Perhaps, like Valen, he simply could not stay away from something that defied everything he thought he knew. They landed at the edge of the Deep Zone on day 31. Exactly 1 month after Elena Vasquez had crashed in a place where survival was supposed to be measured in minutes, not days. The jungle seemed to press against them from the moment they stepped off the shuttles, thick and hostile and hungry. Bioluminescent plants pulsed in warning patterns. Things moved in the shadows between trees. The air itself felt heavy with Threat Valen had brought 20 soldiers, all of them armed with the best weapons the Galactic Union could provide. And still she felt vulnerable, exposed, like prey waiting to be taken. "This way," Kethral said, his 8 limbs carrying him forward with the careful grace of someone who understood exactly how dangerous this place truly was. The last thermal signature was detected 2 kilometers northeast. They moved as a group, tight and defensive, weapons ready for threats that could come from any direction. Every sound made them flinch. Every movement in their peripheral vision sent hands reaching for triggers. It took them nearly 3 hours to travel 2 kilometers, and by the end of it, Valen had developed a new appreciation for what Elena must have endured every single day for the past month. They found the first sign of her halfway. There, a tree marked with strange symbols, carved deep into the bark in patterns that looked almost like a language. One of the scientists scanned it and reported that the carvings matched human writing, though the words were in a form the translation software could not parse. "She is leaving herself notes," Valen realized. "Marking paths, recording information. She is treating this jungle like a research project." Further along, they found one of her traps, a pit covered with leaves, concealing sharpened stakes below. Something had fallen into it recently, judging by the blood still staining the wood. Clever design, Kethral admitted grudgingly. Simple but effective. She is using the jungle's own materials against it. The soldiers began to relax slightly, their fear gradually replaced by something closer to awe. This human had not merely survived. She had started to tame this place, and then they found the camp. Camp was not the right word, Valen realized as she stepped into the clearing. Settlement came closer, though even that seemed insufficient. What Elena had built was nothing less than a fortress, a bastion of human ingenuity in the heart of the most hostile environment. The galaxy had ever known. Walls of hardite dense wood surrounded a central area roughly 30 meters across. The logs fitted together with a precision that spoke of careful planning and endless patience. At strategic points along the walls, sharpened stakes jutted outward, ready to impale anything that tried to climb over. Inside the walls, Valen saw structures that made her breath catch in her throat. There was a shelter built from salvaged shuttle parts and woven vegetation, waterproofed with some kind of dried sap. There was a fire pit with a smoking rack above it, strips of meat hanging to dry in the heat. There was a water collection system that channeled the alien rain into storage containers made from hollowed plants. There were weapons mounted at defensive positions, spears tipped with predator teeth, clubs made from dense wood, something that looked disturbingly like a crossbow assembled from shuttle debris and animal sinew. And in the center of it all, sitting calmly beside her fire, as if she had been expecting them all along, was Dr. Elena Vasquez. She looked different than her file photo, thinner, harder. Her skin darkened by exposure and marked with scars that had not existed a month ago. Her clothes had been supplemented with patches of animal hide and woven fibers. Her eyes had changed most of all, gaining a sharp and calculating quality that reminded Valen uncomfortably of Kethral's predator gaze. "Took you long enough," Elena said, not bothering to stand. "I was beginning to think I would have to walk to the edge of the zone myself." Kethral moved forward slowly, his hunting instinct screaming warnings that his conscious mind could not fully process. Everything about this human had changed. She held herself differently, moved differently, watched them with the assessment of someone used to identifying threats and opportunities. "How?" he asked, the question bursting out of him before he could stop it. "How did you survive the unsurvivable?" Elena smiled, and it was not a soft expression. It was the smile of someone who had looked death in the face every single day for a month and never once blinked. "Where I come from," she said, "we have a saying, adapt or die. My species chose adapting. We have been doing it for 300,000 years. Ever since the first humans walked out of Africa, and spread across a planet that tried to kill them at every turn. She stood finally, gesturing at the jungle around them, at the walls she had built, at the trophies of predators she had killed hanging from posts near the entrance. "This place is dangerous," she continued. "I will not pretend otherwise. It has tried to kill me every single day, and it will probably try again tomorrow. But compared to what my ancestors faced, compared to ice ages and famines and predators that hunted us before we had weapons or fire," she shrugged, a casual motion that somehow made Kethril feel smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life. This was just camping. Valen looked around at the settlement, at the evidence of a month spent not merely surviving, but thriving, learning, conquering. She thought about all the species that had tried and failed to establish a presence in this jungle. All the elite hunters and advanced soldiers who had died within days of entering the deep zone, and she understood. Finally, what humans truly were. They were not the weakest species in the galaxy. They were not fragile prey waiting to be hunted. They were something far more dangerous. Survivors who refused to accept the possibility of defeat, who looked at impossible odds and saw only puzzles to be solved. "Dr. Vasquez," Valen said quietly, "would you be willing to come with us back to Station 12? Elena glanced around at the home she had built, the jungle she had conquered, the territory she had claimed as her own. "Yes," she said after a moment, "but I am bringing my notes. I have documented everything I learned about this place, every plant, every predator, every danger, and every opportunity. It would be a waste to leave that knowledge behind." She walked to her shelter and emerged carrying a stack of flat bark pieces covered in hand-drawn maps and dense handwriting. A month of survival condensed into data that would change everything the galaxy knew about. Kethvora Prime Kethril watched her gather her things, and for the first time in his life, the greatest hunter in 12 systems found himself looking at a human not as prey, not as a curiosity, not as a lesser being. He looked at her as an equal, and somewhere deep in his hunter's soul, a new understanding began to take root. The council chamber fell silent as Elena Vasquez finished her presentation, her voice still carrying the rough edge of someone who had spent a month talking only to herself. Behind her, holographic displays showed map after map of Kethvora Prime's deep zone, areas that had never been documented before, regions that no survey team had ever survived long. Enough to explore, she had covered more ground in 31 days than every previous expedition combined. The apex. Predators are strictly territorial, she explained, pointing to colored zones on the map. They will not cross these boundaries under any circumstances, which means the spaces between their territories are relatively safe corridors for travel. The spore-producing plants follow a predictable bloom cycle based on temperature and humidity, making it possible to anticipate and avoid them. The carnivorous vines respond only to rapid movement, so maintaining a slow pace renders them essentially harmless. She clicked to the next display, showing detailed drawings of alien flora that the xenobotanists in the audience recognized as completely unknown to science. I identified 47 new plant species during my time in the zone, including 3 that show promising pharmaceutical applications. This one here, she pointed to a twisted purple growth, produces a compound that accelerated my healing significantly when applied to wounds. I believe it may have applications in battlefield medicine. Councillor Vethmar, a Tovasi elder who had overseen the original decision to declare Elena dead, leaned forward in his seat. "Dr. Vasquez, forgive my bluntness, but how is any of this possible? Our best hunters could not survive more than a few days in that environment. How did a human with no natural weapons, no armor, no environmental adaptations manage to not only survive, but conduct scientific research?" Elena considered the question for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "When I was young," she began, "my grandmother used to tell me stories about our ancestors. She told me about people who crossed frozen wastelands with nothing but animal skins and determination. She told me about tribes who hunted creatures 10 times their size using coordination and patience. She told me about humans who survived famines, plagues, ice ages, and extinctions that wiped out species far better equipped than we were. She looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates from dozens of worlds. Creatures with claws and venom and armor and 1,000 other natural advantages that humans lacked. My species did not survive because we were the strongest or the fastest or the deadliest. We survived because we refused to accept that anything is impossible. When we encounter an obstacle, we do not turn back, we adapt, we learn, we overcome. It is written into our very nature, coded into our genes across 300,000 years of fighting for existence against everything our planet could throw at us. She gestured at the maps behind her, at the detailed documentation of a jungle that had killed everyone else who had ever tried to understand it. HFY Prime is dangerous, but it follows rules. Everything follows rules. My only advantage was that I refused to die before I figured out what those rules were. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. Commander Violin, watching from the back of the room, thought about everything she had witnessed over the past month. She thought about the first reports of thermal signatures in the deep zone. She thought about the growing legend of the Pale Ghost. She thought about the settlement Elena had built, the trophies she had claimed, the absolute certainty in her eyes when she declared that her experience had been just camping. The Dervasi representative spoke first, his voice heavy with something that might have been awe or might have been fear. We thought sending a human to HFY Prime was a death sentence, he said slowly. We believed, as we have always believed, that your species was soft and fragile and unsuited for hostile environments. We were wrong. He paused, his many eyes fixed on Elena with an intensity that made several other delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. We sent a predator into that jungle, he continued. The apex kind. The kind that does not need claws or venom or armor. The kind that simply needs time. Other delegates began murmuring among themselves, conversations breaking out in a dozen languages as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for less than 50 years, still widely viewed as newcomers, still struggling to earn respect from civilizations that measured their histories in millennia in 31 days. Elena Vasquez had changed everything. The data she brought back would revolutionize the study of HFY Prime. Her maps covered terrain that no scanner had ever reached. Her botanical samples included plants that might cure diseases or revolutionize industries. Her behavioral notes on the apex predators filled gaps in knowledge that had puzzled xenobiologists for decades. But more important than any data was the story itself. The tale that spread across the galactic network within hours of her presentation. A lone human, stranded in the most hostile environment known to civilization, not only survived but thrived. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Do not underestimate these soft-skinned creatures from the third planet of an unremarkable star. Beneath their fragile exteriors beats the heart of something that has spent 300,000 years refusing to die in the weeks that followed. Human applications to dangerous survey missions increased by 400%. Every expedition wanted at least one human on their team. Someone who could adapt when things went wrong. Someone who would not give up when survival seemed impossible. Elena herself returned to HFY Prime 6 months later, this time leading a fully equipped research team. The jungle that had tried so hard to kill her would give up its secrets whether it wanted to or not. Kethral met her at the landing zone, his hunting instincts still screaming warnings whenever she was near. You are going back, he said. Not quite a question, of course, Elena replied. There is so much more to learn. I barely scratched the surface during my first visit. Kethro studied her for a long moment. This soft-skinned human who had done what his warriors could not, who had walked through death itself and emerged stronger. "May I accompany you?" he asked, the words surprising even himself. "I wish to learn how you see, how you think, how you turn impossible situations into merely difficult ones." Elena smiled that sharp smile that had so unsettled him when they first met. "Try to keep up," she said, and walked into the jungle without looking back. Kethro followed, and as the bioluminescent canopy closed over them, he thought about what the Tavasi elder had said in the council chamber. Humanity was not the weakest species in the galaxy. They were survivors of a planet that had tested them for longer than most civilizations had existed, and they had passed every test. They were not fragile prey waiting to be hunted. They were adapters, learners, problem solvers who refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. They were creatures who looked at the impossible and saw only a challenge, and now they were part of the galactic community, bringing that relentless survival instinct to every world they touched. The galaxy had no idea what it was in for, but it was about to find out. They had said it could not be done, that no one could survive the alien jungle of Kethvora Prime. They had been wrong about Elena Vasquez, and somewhere deep in his ancient hunter's soul, Kethro suspected they would be wrong about humanity again and again, for as long as the stars continued to burn.